Good evening. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and it is an honor and pleasure to be with you here this evening co-hosting the next in our series, The Moral Sense in Politics and Policy. You know, the last event that we did together, Cherie, was just about a year ago, and we welcomed Tim Carney to the stage on the evening of a major hailstorm. That reduced our attendance from about 250 registrations to about 50. Tonight we are here in the midst of a plague. And as we plan our next event in the fall, I think that everybody should be thinking about and looking at the weather forecast for locusts. And when you see that, you know the next Trinity Forum Pepperdine event is happening. That event a year ago with Tim was about his book, Alienated America. And obviously tonight we are here to discuss Ross Douthat's important new book, The Decadent Society. And at first blush, you might wonder, why would a graduate school of public policy really care about such non-technocratic questions like alienation, loneliness, disconnection, and stagnation? But we were a school and are a school founded by the late, great political scientist, Dr. James Q. Wilson. It was Wilson who created our curriculum shortly after writing the very important book, The Moral Sense. And even to this day, as we teach out of the James Q. Wilson core, the important part that makes us distinctive as a graduate policy school is the blending of a liberal arts curriculum along with the quantitative coursework that you'll see in so many places, to ask the questions related to the moral sense that in many ways Ross is taking on in this book. What happens when we don't have an adequate sense of our own moral sense? Now, in particular, tonight is being hosted by an initiative at the policy school called the American Project on the Future of Conservatism. This is a nonpartisan but ideological exploration of the future of the conservative movement. And as Wilson was a great Californian, we are in many ways following the footsteps and philosophy described and depicted in a series of books by the late, great California sociologist Robert Nisbet. Nisbet is the author of The Quest for Community, which is a kind of a foundational book in our work at the American Project, envisioning a communitarian conservatism as a way of reconnecting people to the social fabric and to one another. And certainly institutions of faith are important to that. As I was preparing my remarks for introduction and welcoming tonight and reading so much about Ross's new book, I was taken back to another one of Nisbet's book that he wrote back in 1980, The History of the Idea of Progress. And as so much of what Ross is going to be talking about tonight, is what happens when a society or a culture stops progressing. Why does that happen? It sent me back to Nisbet's work in this area, and I just wanted to quote this one passage that might help frame tonight's important conversation. So at this point, Nisbet has been discussing the idea of progress, where it came from, the background in Western civilization, but towards the end, he is describing a world that he foresees in many ways as losing this idea. And at this point, and towards the end, he's talking about progress at bay, he calls it. And he looks back at a time in the early 1900s, late 1800s, when progress seemed to have no end to it. And he writes this: "Then it was easy to maintain belief in progress, and so believing, to seek to add to what a cherished past had contributed. It is no longer easy, for behind the death of the past, the displacement of Western pride of civilization, the waning faith in economic growth and in the works of reason, lies the more abundantly of religious conviction, of belief and faith in something greater than the life immediately around us." And then he jumps to Tocqueville, quoting him from Democracy in America. "In ages of faith, the final aim of life is placed beyond life. The men of these ages, therefore, naturally and almost involuntarily, accustom themselves to fix their gaze for many years on some immovable object towards which they are continually tending. And they learn by insensible degrees to repress a multitude of petty, passing desires in order to be able to content that great and lasting desire which possesses them. This explains why religious nations have so often achieved such great and lasting results for which they were thinking only of the other world. They found out the great secret of success in this. But in proportion as the light of faith grows dim, the range of man's sight is circumscribed. So tonight, I think we are going to look at what happens when a culture begins to circumscribe, when it begins to look inward, when it disconnects from the vertical and focuses only on the horizontal. These are questions that are difficult to quantify. And as much as we care about cost-benefit analysis and multiple regressions at the policy school, none of those work on these kinds of questions. But these are the questions that really matter. Getting these questions right is what really matters. And so that's why we're so excited as the policy school to co-host this next event in our Moral Sense series. And so without further ado, please welcome up my dear friend, Cherie Harder, who will introduce tonight's speakers.
Thank you, Pete. Well, thank you, Pete, for that kind introduction. And I'll just add my own welcome to all of you to tonight's evening conversation with Ross Douthat and Christine Emba on the Decadent Society. As Pete noted, this is one in a long-running series of events that Trinity Forum and the Pepperdine School of Public Policy has hosted together. We've covered various light topics ranging from the persistence of guilt in a post-religious world to the importance of friendship to reforming public theology to decadence. So it's been a real pleasure to be able to explore some of the questions that matter most and to do it with good friends like Pete and with Pepperdine. So thank you so much for that, Pete. I'm also just delighted that each of you hardy and intellectually curious souls have braved pestilence to join us tonight. Part of our purpose with this series is to build community and to build friendship. And so it's rather awkward to try to reconcile that with urging social distancing. But that's what we are doing, and that's probably part of what you're already sensing tonight. The chairs are a little bit further apart. There's hand sanitizer everywhere on each of your chairs. There should be a little antiseptic towelette in case you didn't get the idea with a hand sanitizer. So we just encourage the elbow bump rather than the hug and so on, so everyone stays safe and healthy. I'd also just like to give a shout out to one of our trustees, Richard Miles, and his wife, Phoebe Miles, who joined us tonight. We're so delighted that you're here. Also pleased that Parker and Patty Williamson from the Stover Foundation, who've supported the work of both Trinity Forum and Pepperdine, have joined us. Delighted to have you, Parker and Patty. And in the interest of social connection and social cohesion, I also want to give a shout out to my relatively new husband, Chris Spiegelmeyer. One of the first evening conversations he could join us for with that status. So thanks, honey. We know there were many people who wanted to join us tonight but could not for one reason or the other. So if you have friends who wanted to be here but could not make it, fear not. We are live streaming tonight on both YouTube and on Facebook, and we encourage you to encourage them to take advantage of that. We'll also have photos up both on Facebook as well as comments on Twitter that people can respond to. If you have questions, comments that didn't get responded to tonight, we encourage you to reach out in that way. If this is your first time and you are not familiar with the Trinity Forum, we work to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage the great questions of life in the context of faith. And we do that by trying to provide readings and publications which draw upon the classic works of literature and the humanities to explore the enduring questions and connect the timeless wisdom of the humanities with the timely questions of the day, as well as sponsoring programs like this one tonight, to connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders and engaging those big questions of life, and ultimately, we hope, coming to better know the author of the answers. As we've noted in evening conversations like this before, it's been said that the big questions of life essentially boil down to three. What is a good person? What is the good life? And what is a just society? And as we have with previous events, our author tonight will attempt to grapple with all three simultaneously, explaining and exploring our growing sense of demoralization and its impact on our character, our society, our systems, and our future. Our speaker tonight makes a provocative claim that we have become a decadent society. Such decadence he defines as a particular sort, not merely of immorality, hedonism, or an excess that might evoke images of Nero, orgies, or second helpings of chocolate cake, but in his words, economic stagnation, institutional decay, and cultural and intellectual exhaustion at a high level of material prosperity and technological development. He notes that although we live in the richest country in the history of the world, with unprecedented comforts, conveniences, and technological advancements, our cultural imagination and aspirations have withered. He quotes Peter Thiel, "We were promised flying cars. We got 140 characters." Ross argues that what has been seen as the brightest and the most dynamic part of the economy, the technology sector, largely runs on what he calls let's pretendism, the enthusiasm for an investment in, quote, technologies that have almost arrived, business models that are on their way to profitability, by runways that go on and on without ever achieving liftoff. The stalling of the tech engine is combined in his argument with a sclerotic political establishment, falling birth rates, and a derivative and repetitive pop culture, what he calls the four horsemen of decadence and a harbinger of decline. He also argues that this state of affairs, while soul-sapping, may also be remarkably sustainable. Increasingly, our vices offer their own protections and their own anesthesia. Porn, drugs, the internet, and other addictions and distractions keep us subdued and indoors, not outside causing mayhem. There is a docility to our despair. So what then can we do to shake off such decadence, to restore the ties that bind and build people, neighborhoods, and communities, that reinvigorate the character-forming relationships and institutions that ground us and grow us, and to catalyze a renaissance and renewal? Ross offers a variety of possibilities, but also offers an overlooked option that, in his words, decadence ends when people look heavenward, towards God, the stars, or both. It is a provocative, fascinating, and even controversial argument, and one that our keynote speaker makes with no small amount of energy, power, creativity, and not a hint of decadence. Ross is the author of the newly released The Decadent Society, How We Became Victims of Our Own Success, as well as an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, a role that he's held for over 10 years and assumed as the then youngest columnist in the history of the New York Times. He also co-hosts the New York Times podcast, The Argument, with fellow columnist, and is the film critic for National Review, previously serving as the senior editor at The Atlantic. In addition to his newest work, he is the author of several diverse books, including To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism, Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, Privilege, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class, and with co-author Rahim Salam, Grand New Party, How Republicans can win the working class and save the American dream. Ross's creativity and generativity extend beyond the literary and journalistic. He and his wife, Abigail, will soon be welcoming their fourth child, a baby girl, into the world. Yeah. Responding to Ross is Christine Emba. Christine is an op-ed columnist and editor at the Washington Post, where she explores and writes on the big ideas of society and culture. She's in the midst of writing a book entitled Rethinking Sex, on both the failures and potential of sexual ethics in a post-Me Too world, so stay tuned for that. She previously served as the Hilton Kramer Fellow in Criticism at the New Criterion and a deputy editor at The Economist, where she focused on innovation and technology. She holds her BA from Princeton and lives here in DC. After Ross provides keynote remarks and Christine responds, we will have a brief moderated conversation between the three of us, followed by questions from the audience. Ross, welcome.
Thank you for that incredibly kind, possibly too kind introduction, and welcome everyone to the last public event to be held in Washington, D.C. for the foreseeable future. It's wonderful to be here with you all like Frodo and Master Samwise at the end of all public events, at least. Hopefully not all things. In the spirit of, I suppose, addressing Pete's very kind opening remarks, I'm going to start by talking about decadence in terms that I think are very appropriate to a school of public policy. Because part of the argument that I try and make in my book is that decadence might actually be at least somewhat quantifiable, and that we can sort of observe the nature and sort of sketch, observe the trends and patterns that we call decadence in ways that don't just boil down to either a matter of aesthetic taste or to competing moral judgments. So I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to expand, I suppose, on the first three of the four horsemen of decadence that Cherie mentioned, and then move from there to a discussion of the sort of moral, spiritual, and religious elements that I think are in play. And hopefully I won't go on too long, and then Christine will say something provocative and fascinating in response, and we'll continue from there. So what do I mean when I suggest that decadence is quantifiable? So my own definition, the idea of decadence as a kind of period of repetition and stagnation and so forth at a high level of development that Cherie quoted, is stolen from / adapted from the work of the great cultural critic Jacques Barzun, who rather famously wrote a book 20 years ago entitled From Dawn to Decadence, in which he argued that the term decadence should be not be seen as a critique or a slur, but as a technical label for a stage that successful societies, maybe not inevitably, but very often enter into, a period when lines of advance seem foreclosed, when institutions function painfully, is the phrase he used, which I think here in Washington, D.C., we're all familiar with how that works, and boredom and fatigue become great historical forces, and people become accustomed to the absurd. I always found that Barzunian definition very vivid, and I've sort of returned to it many times over the years, and I particularly thought that it made a useful bridge between two somewhat different responses to our own era that are very commonplace in public argument. One response is a kind of catastrophist reading of our circumstances, where we are hurtling forward towards some post-human future, some ecological catastrophe, some looming American Civil War, some total demoralization and complete loss of religious faith. That's the pessimistic take. And then whenever anyone offers it, up speaks the voice of, let's say, a Steven Pinker, to say, what are you people talking about? Look at the statistics. These are the best times to be a human being in history. Life expectancy is at an all-time high. America is the wealthiest society in human history. We've made all kinds of progress. The rest of the world is making all kinds of progress. Aren't you just making yourself unhappy, as human beings tend to do, in circumstances that objectively would have seemed to our ancestors as utopian? And I think decadence is maybe the bridge between those two perspectives, because decadence says, on the one hand, yes, Pinker is correct. We are not in a state of material collapse or even necessarily material decline. We are amazingly technologically proficient. We are a relatively peaceful and stable society. maybe more so, maybe substantially more so than we were, say, 40 or 50 years ago in the 1960s or 1970s, for all the tumult and chaos of the Trump era. In fact, if you go to American cities or college campuses, you won't find anything like the sort of mobs and protests and surges of violence that characterized America a couple generations back. So that argument is true so far as it goes. But what it misses is the point that Barzoon makes, which is the point that drives people's pessimism, even their despair, which is the reality that we have advanced to a certain point and feel like there's nowhere else to go. And we feel like we've reached this stage of development and are stuck there, going in circles, recycling ideas and arguments and cultural forms. So what do I mean by stuckness beyond that sort of impressionistic sense of where our intellectual debates are? Well, here's where the statistical James Q. Wilson style analysis comes into play, right? First of all, the Western world, the United States, Western Europe, have been characterized since the 1970s by economic deceleration, which is not quite the same as perfect stasis or stagnation. We have continued to have some growth in the current economic boom that may have just ended in the last couple weeks. We have achieved a pretty consistent 2% growth over a sustained period of time. So growth hasn't disappeared, but it has declined markedly from what was experienced in sort of the sweep of the Industrial Revolution, especially in the post-war boom. You don't have the kind of exponential growth patterns that you can trace in the modern world up to the 1960s. When people talk about the idea of the singularity as this period of total liftoff where exponential growth just goes vertical, you could argue, as the blogger Scott Alexander writes, that in fact the singularity was canceled somewhere in the mid-1960s, that instead of going like this, we started going like this and started to level off. And tellingly, even the growth that we achieved is achieved on the backs of massive fiscal deficits, which I think are quite defensible as a policy matter, more so than some conservatives do, a sort of necessary, it's better to have sustainable deficits that give you 2% growth than austerity that gives you 0.5% growth. But they tell us something about the underlying structure of the economy, that if you can have 5% growth with hardly any deficits at all in the 1950s, and today we have World War II-style deficits and we can barely get to 2%, then something dramatic has changed in Western economies. And you can see the same thing if you make comparisons between, say, the United States and Europe. In the 1970s, as the US started to stagnate, there was a view that European economies were going to catch up and maybe leap beyond us. And so for a while there was an idea that the economic future might belong to Europe, and then in the early 1990s to Japan. And in each case, our economic rivals have instead converged with us and entered the same, or failed to quite converge with us and ended up at a slightly lower level. And you have the same deceleration just about everywhere, including possibly next in China, again, pending developments over the next 6 months to a year. So that's the economic component of decadence. And then the technological component is more controversial because obviously there has been a certain amount of innovation. This is an amazing device. I carry, the wealth of the world's information in my pocket in a way that nobody ever has in the human past, and that's different from the world of 1965 or 1985 or even the world when I went away to college. So that's all real. But the trouble comes in, one, when the internet economy tries to plow its resources back into other areas of the economy. You tend to get a Theranos or a WeWork or these kind of companies that are sort of, much like our public deficits, are floated on the surplus of our wealth for a long time. And it's very nice to be able to take an Uber at the expense of venture capitalists, right, who are paying for my Uber. That's lovely. But it's not, it's not Henry Ford inventing the automobile. It's not an industry that actually clearly has some sort of deeply sustainable basis beyond this surplus being used to keep it afloat. So that's one difficulty, and it reflects the larger difficulty that innovation outside Silicon Valley really does seem to have slowed down. And again, this is arguably quantifiable. If you look at productivity growth, which is contested, but I think generally is the best measure of technology's impact on the economy. You have, as with economic deceleration, a dramatic slowdown in productivity growth from the 1970s on. And then you have one exceptional period in the late 1990s as the internet comes online where you get a boost, a productivity surge. 5 to 7 years of non-decadence, which is also the period, totally not coincidentally, that produced the best movies of the last 30 years. Now that's entering the realm of the ineffable and unprovable, but it's a slight detour. But then after that, sort of internet dividend, productivity growth slows down again, and it slows more in Europe than in the United States. And so when Andrew Yang, who in certain ways is a lovely and dynamic and fascinating figure, gets up and talks about how the American economy is changing too fast and robots are about to take all our jobs, if you look at the productivity statistics, you could argue that the reverse is true, that the robots don't seem to be coming as fast as anyone would have expected, and that in fact, the threat of the automation revolution, the race against the machine, doesn't seem to actually be happening. And Yang is sort of imagining the problems that a more dynamic society would have instead of recognizing the problems of stagnation that we do have. So those are two areas, I think, where decadence is measurable. In politics, it's a little harder to perfectly measure. There isn't sort of a statistic of government effectiveness or government productivity. But I think you can sort of eyeball things over the last 30 years and, let's say, compare the amount of legislation that a Lyndon Johnson or a Ronald Reagan was able to pass to the amount of legislation that passes Congress under a Barack Obama or a Donald J. Trump. You can do something that a Brookings Institution scholar tried to do, I cited in my book, and try and create an index of government failures ranging from the WMD debacles to the healthcare.gov rollout under Obama. And, in this paper argues that you see a slow but steady increase in government failures from the Reagan through Bush, with a kind of spike around the Iraq War, but then still a pretty high level under Obama. And we seem to be living through a particularly catastrophic government failure, pending developments right now. And then I think you can also just use the evidence of your eyes and see that American government has become more gridlocked, more stalemated, and more dysfunctional pretty steadily over the last 50 years. And I can imagine a sort of James Q. Wilson bureaucracy-style analysis of how we got to this point that I think, again, would fit pretty well in the realm of the sort of quantifiable side of political science. And then finally, the very quantifiable element of decadence is demographic decadence, right? The fact that over this period of economic deceleration, disappointing technological progress, and political sclerosis, people in rich societies have literally stopped reproducing themselves at a rate that would enable existing wealthy populations to continue. And this decadence is universal. The United States was an exception to this rule for a time in the 1990s and early 2000s. Again, the same time that all those great movies were made. And basically, I was born in 1979, so inevitably I'm just nostalgic for the year when I was 19 years old. So that undoubtedly colors my analysis in certain ways. But since that period, since the Great Recession, the United States has joined Western Europe and most of the countries of East Asia in having not just below replacement, but well below replacement fertility rates. And this is, to some extent, a bit of a cultural mystery. You can tell a pretty clear story about why birth rates would decline in an age of, the end of agrarian economies, reduced infant mortality rates, and female empowerment and women, women entering the workforce in large numbers. But it's harder to sort of discern exactly why fertility rates have settled this low. Christine's next book can perhaps help answer that question a bit. But you still have, most men and women alike in the Western world still imagine themselves having families that are above replacement level. And yet somehow there's sort of a breakdown in the way people mate and marry and pair off, and how they balance some of the pleasures of decadence with some of the burdens of economic stagnation, with the cost of raising kids. And the upshot is best case scenario, a 1.7 to 1.8 fertility rate. Worst case scenario, what you have in countries like South Korea, where the fertility rate is half of replacement level, which is a fairly staggering reality. And so this is where I'm going to try and pivot into the larger questions of morality, religion, and sort of the purposefulness of human affairs, because there is one exception to this demographic pattern, which is the state of Israel. It is the only country of its size and wealth in the world that doesn't just have a above replacement fertility rate, but a much, much above replacement fertility rate. Its fertility rate is, I think it's dipped in the last year or so, but it's still above 3, which is to say almost twice as high as the typical sort of analogous wealthy country in Europe or the US or Asia. And what's interesting about this is that it's not just religious Israelis, right, who have more kids. And, you know, there's a pretty obvious pattern in the West that religious families, religious parents tend to have more kids than secular parents. But in Israel, it's both the religious and the secular who have relatively high birth rates. So it's not just that ultra-Orthodox Israelis are having lots of kids, it's also that secular Jewish Israelis are having lots of kids. And I think out of that, you can tell a pretty plausible story about how the kind of quantifiable social science-y elements of decadence interact with issues of sort of cultural imagination and cultural purpose. And it connects to the Nisbet quote in certain ways that I quoted a different Nisbet book. I should have read that one instead and quoted it in my book. But it connects to the Nisbet argument in certain ways because, you know, the state of Israel knows what it's there for, right? There's a very clear story about what Israel is, why it exists, who it exists for, what it's doing, and what its long-term purpose is. And this story is, in some sense, deeply religious, but is also available to secular people, to secular Israelis who are not full believers. And that, I think, is the best way to understand what is being lost or has been lost under decadence in the rest of the developed world, which is a sense, again, as Nisbet says, looking backwards as well as forwards, right? I think, I'm not going to capture quite the way he phrased it, but the idea that a non-decadent society believes in its own past and its own future simultaneously. It believes that it has an inheritance that has great value, that needs to be passed on, and it also believes that it has a destination towards which it is heading. Maybe not immediately, not that the eschaton or the singularity is there immediately, but that every human being alive in the society is participating in a story that stretches backward and forward, and that requires making sacrifices in the here and now to preserve what's gone before and build something better and more dramatic for the future. And in the larger Western world, that narrative had both religious versions and more secularized versions. But I think both the religious, mostly Christian version and sort of the secularized, progress-oriented vision depended in a profound way on the idea of exploration and expansion. And this is not unique to the Western world, but I think it is sort of the extent to which the idea of exploration and expansion has dominated the Western imagination is somewhat unique. And it combines the missionary zeal of Christianity, the idea that you're supposed to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth, with the more secularized, still Christian-influenced vision of sort of exploring the entire world, maybe spreading the blessings of liberty to the entire world, maybe spreading technological progress to the entire world, but basically the whole story that has ended up being wrapped up in narratives of globalization, right? The idea that we're trying to make one world one united human race bound together in all of these various ways. And obviously this is not always a morally admirable way of ordering a civilization, because with expansion and exploration comes conquest and colonization, and sometimes extermination. And part of the argument I try and make in the book is, you cannot always say that non-decadent societies are morally superior to decadent societies, right? A decadent society has lost a certain energy, a certain dynamism, a certain purpose, but non-decadent societies are entirely capable of committing terrible crimes, as Western empires often did. But there is still something distinctive in the role, the sort of psychological role that the idea of a frontier played in the imagination of our civilization. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that we have entered into a period of decadence as we have sort of reached the end, seemingly, of possible existing frontiers, which is why I begin the book and end the book with the space program and with the fact that all of the statistical, sort of measurable, quantifiable trends I'm talking about just happen to begin around the time that human beings made a huge leap, sort of the culmination of the Kitty Hawk to the stars ascent, 60 years, 70 years from the Wright brothers to a man walking on the moon. And having done that, discovered that that frontier was actually a lot harder to explore and colonize and transform than people expected in the 50s and 60s. And people really did expect that space was going to be a kind of new frontier. There were obviously critics of the space program and people thought who wasted money and was just a Cold War indulgence. But there was also a pretty widespread cultural assumption that there would be moon bases and there would be space elevators and taking things up to space stations, and that we would, if we were in the moon by 1969, we would be at Mars, if not Jupiter, by 2010 or 2050. There was an assumption that Wright brothers to the moon was just going to keep, the line was just going to keep going up. And when that didn't happen, it left a civilization that had this animating idea of progress and exploration without a clear zone of progress, without a clear frontier to explore. It left human beings, in some sense, alone with themselves on a planet that, they had followed the admonition of Genesis. They had filled the earth and, for better or worse, subdued it, and it wasn't clear what was going to happen next. And so that, again, is not quantifiable or provable. I have no study or rigorous paper that says, because we couldn't get into space, our economy stalled, our birth rates fell, and we started only making the same Marvel movies over and over again. And I don't think the causality is quite as simple as that, but neither do I think it's a coincidence. And I think that creates then an interesting challenge for would-be escapees from decadence, if you want to leave decadence behind. Cherie quotes the ending of the book where I sort of try and link the idea of a sort of exploratory renaissance with a religious renaissance. And I do think that there's actually a powerful synthesis there that our society's sort of binaries of science versus religion has lost sight of, right? That, in fact, a society with a lot of religious energy and a lot of scientific energy, will often have that energy proceeding from the same basic assumption, the same basic idea that the universe is in some sense made for human beings, and therefore it makes sense that it would yield its secrets to scientists, and it also makes sense that human beings would be participants in a story that had a capital A author. And so history wasn't just one damn thing after another. There was actually sort of, acts and arcs and narratives and so forth that you could participate in. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that even the space program itself had this fascinating synthesis of kind of, mid-century American technical optimism and mid-century American Protestant optimism. That you have the first flight orbiting the Earth with astronauts reading from the Book of Genesis, and Buzz Aldrin taking communion on the moon. And again, that doesn't mean that doesn't mean that the way you get technological progress today is to, go into labs in Boston or Silicon Valley and have everyone convert to Christianity, and then suddenly they achieve things they can't achieve right now. It's obviously not as simple as that. But I do think there is something there that's useful to ponder if we think about what a Renaissance might mean. But then I also think, that if we aren't destined to go to the stars, if the story of the human future isn't going to involve some great technical leap that enables exploration to begin again, then maybe there is a more profound rethinking that has to be done. And maybe the way to escape from decadence is to leave behind some of the assumptions of perpetual progress that have colored and defined Western civilization for a long time. And that isn't something I get into as much in the book because I'm more drawn to the rockets and Jesuits in space and, things like that. But I think it's a possibility worth considering. And so, yeah, I think I've said mostly enough, but I think I should say one further brief thing, because I'm talking about sort of positive escapes from decadence, either sort of leaps up or philosophical transformations that enable us to live happier and more vigorous lives without the assumption of perpetual progress. But of course, there's a third scenario, which is just straight up catastrophe, right? And I spend a lot of time in the book, like chapters, making the argument that our decadence might be pretty sustainable. That a wealthy society that doesn't have clear rivals that are clearly outpacing us and that has all of these sort of virtual entertainments to retreat into and pharmaceutical options for managing our ennui and all of these things, that, the stability of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is not a totally implausible destination. It's a dark destination, but not a totally implausible destination for a rich, comfortable, and decadent society. But since we're in the time of the coronavirus, right, it is important to note that, the people who assume that decadence ends with the barbarians sweeping in and sacking the over-decorated palaces and so on, are putting their finger on the reality that a decadent society has vulnerabilities that a vigorous and dynamic society does not. And I don't think the coronavirus is the enemy that will exploit our vulnerabilities to the point of actually, leading to worldwide catastrophe, civil war, total reordering of the map, all those kind of things. I think we will still look sustainably decadent when, God willing, we come out the other side. But I think it's very clear from looking at the American response so far to this pandemic that our decadence makes us vulnerable in all its different forms, the populist forms of decadence, the bureaucratic forms of decadence, the failures of politicians, the failures of the media, the failures of people to sort of imagine things outside the norm of everyday repetition. And I think that is sort of a key part of my argument, right? That we think, especially in the Trump era, that we're conditioned to expect crisis, right? Because, you turn on Twitter and, it's a crisis in the Republic and, Trump is doing this or the resistance is doing that, the deep state is doing that. But I think that's mostly performative. And I think at some level people know it's performative and are comfortable with it and have the assumption that, you go on Twitter, experience a virtual 1968 or a virtual 1935, and then you go back to your everyday life and the everyday life will just keep going on. And it may keep going on. There are good reasons to think it might, but sometimes it's the mask of the Red Death, and something crazy is about to happen. And when your system is sclerotic and stalemated and unadaptable, very bad things can sometimes happen before sustainability reasserts itself. So I am hoping and praying that not too many of those bad things happen in the stress that our decadence is facing. But I think all of us, as we leave here tonight and go off to the quarantine that awaits us, should pray that our decadence is a little more resilient than it's looked the last few weeks. So thank you all so very, very much.
So thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you, Ross, and thank you, Cherie and the Trinity Forum for putting this together and actually keeping it on, considering everything that's happening. And thank you for inviting me to discuss a topic that I find endlessly fascinating. So when I started reading this book, The Decadent Society, my first emotion was something of fear, but mainly because I felt as though I had been surveilled for years. You see, decadence had become something of a morbid running joke among certain friends of mine back a few years ago when I lived in New York City. We would clink together our elaborate bespoke cocktails and stage elaborate long brunches in our tiny and grubby apartments, and we would whisper to each other, "Is this decadence or decline?" And then we'd share a guilty smile and continue on. We were young. We were living in the biggest, richest society in the world, and we were attempting a sort of Brideshead Revisited style ennui. I think, though, that we weren't actually so decadent, though we played at it, because we truly loved and relished life, and we looked forward to a future that was still coming. There was somewhere to go. And for what it's worth, more than one of those friends has since pushed back against decadence by becoming a friar or a nun, devoting themselves to a life of orthodoxy and vivid faith. And me, I moved to DC. DC is where decadence really lives. Every one of the four horsemen that Ross has mentioned is present and is probably expensing a dinner at Les Dip right now, and they probably invited you and you chose not to go and instead came here. So thank you for that. But we really do have them all. I mean, stagnation. One would have thought with a wealthy government, a profusion of international nonprofits in this city, and even an incoming tech company that's also sort of paying my salary at the Washington Post, we would have ended world hunger. Instead, I can now have a sweet green salad hand-delivered to my office for a price that, when I think about it, means that I probably could have planted and harvested the entire salad myself. We have sterility. If you walk through DuPont Circle, or really any neighborhood in DC, you will notice a profusion of well-kempt people and empowered women between the ages of 25 and 40. You'll notice the profusion of small dogs. You will also, it's true, they're everywhere. They've just stopped wearing their fancy coats because it became warm yesterday, but I kind of miss it. But you'll also notice a kind of shocking lack of children. And sclerosis, I mean, Congress is based in DC, and enough said about that, the better. And then, of course, repetition. Bernie Sanders is on the ballot again. Joe Biden is on the ballot again. Donald Trump is on the ballot again. And The Bachelorette is on season 16, and I know that some of you are going to watch it. Even seemingly unrelated stories about decadence have a DC tie-in. One of the most read pieces in Ross's own newspaper last week was about a woman who hosts week or month-long classes in wilderness training for yuppies who want to learn how to live the primitive life. Apparently, for a few $100s, you can go with her and learn how to tan deer hides and start fires with flint. The woman who teaches these classes goes by the name Lynx and is based on a property in Washington state. But her DC-based daughter answers her email. It's not that I have anything against DC, of course, but it's easy to take things for granted, to assume that decadence is normal, when you're living in what could truly be called the heart of the empire. Of course, now it seems that the empire is striking back with coronavirus, yes, and our response to it. So in Ross's book, microbes are mentioned as one of the ways that our current stasis could die. There's this idea that history could be restarted by something like a bolt from the blue, something that wakes us from our torpor. I'm not sure that we've been awakened quite yet. The Decadent Society is vulnerable, but it hasn't yet crumbled. That said, our torpor is definitely being exposed. Our government is clearly too sclerotic and stagnant to respond with speed. For all our innovations in science, our iPhones and our Teslas, a vaccine is definitely more than a year away. For all the money that we've poured into our concierge healthcare systems, our hospitals are ill-prepared for a surge in use. And we individuals, well, we're absurd. We're stocking up on toilet paper. We're figuring out how to delicately bump elbows at networking events. We're squabbling over the last bag of frozen organic blueberries at Trader Joe's. We're worried about our loved ones, certainly, but we're also checking the Charles Schwab app to bemoan the state of our investments because yesterday's market wobbles were like a little bit stressful. We're posting about self-isolation on Twitter, and we're exploring the limits of taste with the hottest and best coronavirus memes. We're sort of preparing for the end of the world, but we're mostly waiting with a kind of exhaustion and in some cases boredom for things to just happen already. Decadence is a sibilant and resonant word. It's one that speaks to privilege, but also to our own failures. It's an acknowledgement, when it comes down to it, of our own rot. What are we doing? That these are our pursuits, that these are our complaints. What sort of sad, padded lives have we been leading anyway? Why does everything seem so disappointing? Is it just us, or is it the world? And yet, why hasn't anything changed? On some level, being able to sit in our comfortable homes or lecture halls and mull over the concept of decadence in the midst of a crisis is decadence. We're acting the part of worrying, but we aren't exactly running outside to foment the revolution or to quell the spread of disease ourselves. But in the face of decadence, I'm not sure that acting is entirely the wrong idea. Not play acting, though, as my friends and I did, but acting as if there's something ahead, something that can be done, even if we're not yet sure what it is. I'm writing my own book, as Shuri mentioned, and it's about sexual ethics and how we should relate to each other in the wake of Me Too. So our sexual culture, talk about decadence if you want to. But while I still haven't found a grand fix or some sort of switch that we can flip to make things better, I'm increasingly convinced that our way forward could be in this acting. I think that we, women and men both, should want more. We should expect more from each other. We should act more ourselves. We should resist numbness, even if it means pretending in some ways. And we should resist the giving into a disappointing state of things. The world is what it is right now, but we can still try to make it something else. We can act as though we're better than we are. In our time of coronavirus, perhaps the action is just leaving some hand sanitizer on the shelf in CVS for someone else to buy. It might be taking a break from our self-interested hoarding and instead thinking of how to strengthen our attenuating social ties in the event of an even more isolating quarantine. It might mean the daily task of beating back our own nihilism and our tendency to self-alienate, even as we're given more reasons to question the system and more excuses to order from Amazon and not see a single soul for the rest of the month of March. It could be as simple as remembering that what we do actually matters, whether it's washing our hands vigorously and using the sanitizing towels under your chair, or attending to the fears of our coworkers, our family, our friends. Decadence may be here. It does sort of feel like we have been living in it. But perhaps this latest crisis could be the moment we've been waiting for. It could be a wake-up call to push back against our self-absorption. It could be a warning to heed our neglect and our drift. We could act to save ourselves and our loved ones. Early in the book, Ross quotes W.H. Auden and his evocative description of the decadence of the Roman Empire. What's most alarming in Auden's telling is that the empire didn't actually end. It persisted in a slow decline, in decadence, for 4 centuries, without creativity, warmth, or hope. It may be true that we've settled into our own time of decadence. We have made it to the moon. The frontier seems to be closed. But a sliver of light still remains. Creativity, warmth, hope. We can still choose to exercise all of these things ourselves. Now, in fact, may be the time to act. Thank you.
Never be too careful. Well, thank you for that, Ross, for Christine. Very much appreciate that. So much to think about. So I will throw out just a few questions, and then we're going to turn it over to you. But one of the things that I could almost feel might be coming up in people's minds as you talked, Ross, were first just some of the thoughts. Well, what about AI? What about the huge increases in genetics? What about Moore's Law? What about the sharing economy exemplified by Airbnb? What about all these dynamic new developments that are happening? But in addition to that, the assumption that there needs to be grand steps forward and frontiers to conquer. It seems like often in times of great dynamism, we yearn for peace and prosperity in our time. So, and stability is something that is sought and yearned for. So the attainment of it, does the stability always indicate stagnation? Or can we at some point arrive?
So, I mean, this is the question I was trying to gesture at, I guess, a little bit in saying that, you know, thinking about alternative ways to live, right, that are not conditioned on the dream of progress. And I do think there's actually a fairly widespread version of that argument that doesn't frame itself in exactly in this way, but in the book I call it basically the case for sustainable decadence, right? The idea being that, you know, the Earth has finite resources. If we're going to be an earthbound species for the indefinite future, we can't expect permanent growth because permanent growth would be cancerous. You have the climate crisis to think about. There are good reasons why you might want, population decline if population growth is unsustainable. And so the goal then becomes, maybe as you suggest, the sort of management of stability. And I think I think our politics sort of oscillates back and forth between a desire to escape from decadence and a desire to manage stability. And sometimes it does so in one person. I think the arc of Barack Obama's career as a candidate for president and then as president was to begin as a kind of scourge of decadence, sort of a revival of liberal hope, the channeling of Bobby Kennedy, the idea of a post-racial society, that then, once he became president and sort of gridlock and stalemate reasserted itself, transitioned to Obama, the technocratic, managerial president, sort of trying to do the best he could with the tools available, with a foreign policy of, as one of his aides memorably put it, "Don't do stupid bleep," right? So that's how it happens just in a single presidency, but I think you can maybe see a version of it happening right now, even tonight in the Democratic primary, where I think for the last 4 years, both of our political parties have been convulsed by revolts against decadence. I think both Make America Great Again and Bernie Sanders style socialism are sort of responses to torpor and stagnation. One maybe more nostalgic, but both sort of nostalgic, because Sanders is also sort of hearkening back to a sort of left-wing vision from 40 or 50 years in the past. And they've been very successful, obviously. Donald Trump was actually elected president, and for a week or so, about 2 weeks ago, it looked like Bernie Sanders was going to be the Democratic nominee. But now, perhaps in part because of the coronavirus, a sort of sustainability vision seems to be reasserting itself. And Joe Biden, I think, in many ways, relative to both populist and socialist alternatives, is the candidate of sustainable decadence. Maybe it's physical embodiment at this point. Let's hope so. Let's hope for sustainability. And so I think, I think that look, I didn't vote for Donald Trump in 2016. I have a strong affection for an attraction toward the populists of the right who want to shake up the Reagan consensus and, create a new coalition and figure out some new policies to restore the family over here and entrepreneurial dynamism over here. I love this stuff, but I didn't vote for Trump, so I chose sustainable decadence over the risks, right? And I wrote a lot of columns sort of praising Bernie Sanders or arguing that he could be that he could win, that he could be a more effective general election candidate. But when the time came for the Times to assign us all a candidate to write a quasi-endorsement for, I wrote one for Joe Biden. So in my own political, sort of activities, I'm preferring stability, I guess you could say, with all the faults that it has that I try and describe in my book, to the risks of, the risks of sort of revolution and unsettlement. So I have to say, obviously, there is a case for sustainability. And then the quick caveat, though, that I would add is that the problem with sustainability is that, human beings want change, right? Even in the most rooted agrarian Wendell Berry style society, there's going to be the younger son or daughter who doesn't want to stay on the farm. And so a society can't just be sustainable. It has to change. And so if you have a society dedicated to sustainability, I think the danger is that the change you get is a kind of slow decay, basically. And so so the danger I foresee for a sustainably decadent Western world is a sort of very slow dystopian slide that takes you towards Brave New World without anyone fully realizing until it's too late how far you've drifted along. And so the attraction of escaping decadence to me is that kind of attraction. Better a restoration of dynamism with all the risks that entails than just letting yourself slide into virtual reality, pharmaceuticals, and
the mechanisms of stabilization that are ultimately dehumanizing.
So a question for both of you. Ross, one of the more, I guess, controversial things that you argue in your book is so far from our social media interaction stoking fires of polarization and anger, they've actually acted as a safety valve, essentially allowing people to play act 1968, as you put it, as opposed to actually take to the streets. And when I read that, Christine, I thought about something you had written not long ago where you quoted Neil Postman and his different rules of technological change, one of which is that technological change is ecological rather than additive. It changes our very environment, our assumptions, and our imagination. So I'd love for you to comment on whether you think our technological change and the ecological change as a result has resulted in such a transformation of our assumptions and imaginations that they've essentially rendered us passive players in a performative drama.
Ouch. I think I found that part of your book actually really compelling as well, Ross, because that is something that I have observed in myself and also in peers. So I mentioned when I was speaking that some of my peers in youthful decadence had since gone on to actually join the religious life, for instance, become nuns or friars or priests.
Which is not decadent.
To be clear, we're
Definitely
for
not.
that.
We're definitely.
But one thing that I have noticed in the past several years, speaking of extremely online and technologically enabled behavior, is that a number of, at one point, or maybe still similarly seeming devout friends, those who are in some ways very interested in religion and faith, are not necessarily interested in taking the step of joining religious life, but are really interested on being extremely religious online. So agitating for Catholic integralism, or a theocracy that would stretch from Canada to South America, and really getting into fights online with people about that and changing their avatars to the Pope's insignia. And this is Twitter. So they're doing this on Twitter. They have not, again, joined an order. I'm not entirely sure if this has manifested in their own actual religious practices, but they can get their feelings, their devotion out online. They can express it, and in some ways that seems like enough. There's no need to go places or do the things if you can talk about it with your friends in a private Slack channel. But one of the things that Neil Postman says in the same essay is about how technology sort of begins in the imagination. And he cautions that there are technological advances, but it's almost impossible to predict where they'll go without having some sort of end goal in mind. And even if you have that, again, you can't control everything. And I think that this actually relates to the previous question about, stability and change and what it's for. I think that there's always an argument to be made for stability, for safety. But I think that one of the perhaps unfortunate and corrupting and maybe decadent influences on our innovation so far is that we have in some ways lost a clear understanding of what the common good is, what we're innovating for or to, what the goal would be. In the past, in some ways, when innovation was spoken of, or technological advance, it was, we will work harder to have this invention so that then we will have time for, say, leisure, which we will use for philosophizing and going to church and fishing. These were actual goals that people aimed for. And I think one of the more decadent things about our innovation now is that we're innovating for the purpose of innovating so that the stock market can see us innovating. And then we'll do that again, I guess. And there's no point to it. There's no common good, there's no end goal, and you wonder why people get lost or discouraged or not so excited about moving forward anymore. Where do you move forward if there's nowhere to move to?
I see time is rapidly elapsing. At some point this evening, I want you both to talk about the role of religious revival in ending decadence. But we will turn to what's always the most dynamic, non-decadent part of our evening conversation, which is hearing from you in the audience. Those of you who have been to an evening conversation before know we have 3 guidelines for questions. We ask that all questions be brief, all questions be civil, and all questions be in the form of a question. So if you could raise your hands, please wait till you are called on and the microphone is in hand before you ask. That would be great. Right in the back there. If you could stand up so our volunteer with the mic can see you.
Thank you very much for your talk tonight. There's an article I read recently, and I don't remember the name of the chap, but he argues that leisure has no place in society. And that reminds me of Joseph Pieper's work of the same, These Are the Bases of Culture. And I'd be interested in asking the question, what does leisure, true authentic leisure, that points us towards what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful, what role does that play, perhaps in either providing a spark of energy to reviving a decadent society?
So I don't know if this fully fits the Pieperian frame, because I've read more about leisure, the basis of culture, than I have actually read the book itself. This is what columnists do anyway. But I mean, I'll just sort of build on what Christine was saying about sort of the way that technology creates and reshapes an ecosystem. Because I think the most striking thing about the iPhone social media age is that it does seem to sort of kill off true leisure. And I think there's some kind of connection between sort of creative leisure and boredom, right? That human beings need to be bored to some extent in order to deepen their thinking, in order to think creatively, imaginatively, in order to direct themselves out of whatever everyday rut they're in and into something else. And it's a little hard for me to tell because, of course, I'm entering middle age, and the leisure of childhood is far behind, and we have small children, and I have a demanding job, so I probably would find it harder to be bored anyway. But I think it's pretty clear that having an iPhone in your pocket is a way of ensuring that you will never be bored in a way that's at first delightful, and then it, in certain ways, becomes kind of terrible. And I think that is a way that the technology we have has reshaped everyday human existence in a way that has carved away at what was an essential part of human life. Like, it was very hard to go through human life, even if you were in a backbreaking agrarian economy, especially if you were in a backbreaking agrarian economy, without having long periods of boredom, where you didn't have something to occupy your mind, or maybe you had the same 5 books that your household owned to occupy your mind. I've been reading our kids the D'Aulaire's book about Abraham Lincoln, right, where it's like these vivid pictures of him growing up in Kentucky and Illinois and so on. And he was one of the greatest presidents the U.S. ever had, and he grew up in a house with 4 books in it. And obviously they had to do a ton of labor, but there was also, I can only imagine, a scale of boredom the likes of which no modern educated person can imagine. And that was probably within reason, a good thing. And it does seem like something that, something that the technologies we have remove. And to put it in terms of escapes from decadence, I think, the idea of figuring out ways not to abolish new technologies, but to manage them is incredibly important. And this is where I think, my book and my talk and so on are sort of pro-dynamism to some extent, pro-new technology. But there's a weird way, I think, in which if we want to get new innovations, we have to do a better job of managing our relationship to the technology that we have.
If the definition of decadence in some ways, as you said, is a sort of stasis and kind of persisting sameness, then maybe having an iPhone in one's pocket is kind of like the definition of that mentally. Because if you think about boredom versus activity, there is a flux in between, right? You go from sort of boredom and extreme to activity in the end, and there is some movement there that provides interest to life. And then you think of, having an iPhone or a computer or both, sitting in front of a screen all day, and you're never quite bored. You're never quite quiet. There's always some frisson of activity, like some screen to refresh or something, but you're never actually doing anything either. You're not like getting outside. You're not necessarily being excited by something. You're just scrolling or clicking or tapping. And if there's no flux, it's kind of hard for that energy to develop, that energy that either kind of moves you personally forward or moves perhaps a society forward. If everyone is sort of mildly saturated and like mildly interested, mildly satisfied, then how would you be pushed to move? And yeah, I do think that's a contributor to decadence in actually an extreme way. Because it's one thing to feel like that personally, but even as you say in the book, if there's an entire society that's sort of sated and semi-satisfied and like a little itchy but not itchy enough to get anything done, obviously nothing will happen.
Another question. Oh, so many hands are right up. John, right here, if you could stand so Matthew can see you.
Is the decline of the middle, whether that's the middle class or middle range options in cars or supermarkets or anything else, is that a cause or a symptom of decadence?
So one of the writer's tricks that I play in the book is refusing to distinguish between causes and symptoms. But I mean this somewhat seriously. I think there is this profound entanglement between a lot of the forces that I'm describing that makes it really hard to pick out a single villain, a single cause. And so right and left, like in this argument, right, it's like, is it that we don't have enough growth because we're too unequal and stratified? Or is it that we're too unequal and stratified because we don't have enough growth? And you can put either of those into a left or right-wing box to some extent. And I'm trying to argue that, that there's an entanglement here that we can't quite understand and that should require us to draw insights from multiple places and figuring out what to do about it. So I try in the chapter on economics to put Thomas Piketty into conversation with some of my libertarian friends here in DC and argue that they're both getting at a piece of decadence, right? And when the libertarians talk about sort of the captured economy and the ways in which so much of what government does is itself a function of client groups and interest groups and sort of the upper middle as opposed to the middle sort of, hoarding resources for itself. That's all real, and that is sort of a function of, in certain ways, too much government sort of choking off dynamism and allowing the upper middle to sort of maintain itself at the expense of the common good, of sort of broadly shared prosperity. But then at the same time, I think it's reasonable for the left to argue that, there were certain things that we did that were, you can call them libertarian or you could call them neoliberal in order to try and restore growth, right, from the sort of the Thatcher and Reagan era down to the present day. With the liberalization of trade, the deregulation of industry, all of these things that I think that they were eminently defensible when they were done, but I think the left has a reasonable point that they seem to have reached the limits of what they can do, right? That, you've reached a point where the next trade liberalization deal doesn't seem to be generating enough growth to make up for the fact that it too seems to benefit that upper middle more than people in the Rust Belt who ended up voting for Trump. So again, without having a perfect answer to your question, I think there is or should be a kind of fruitful dialogue between left and right that doesn't just say, oh, neoliberalism destroyed the world, right? No, neoliberalism was it was the first response to stagnation. Stagnation kicked in, and the countries that were less neoliberal didn't grow faster. France is not some perfect dynamo, right? So there were good reasons for what the neoliberals did, but at the same time, those policies have reached some limits and have contributed to inequality in their own way. And so perhaps libertarians need new targets, and perhaps there's room for more redistribution than they've acknowledged. But there has to be some sort of, there has to be some sort of new synthesis, basically. And again, a reason to welcome the disturbances of populism and socialism is that they are, at the very least, calls for a new synthesis that aren't just, Paul Ryan and Barack Obama, sort of locked in a certain kind of debate for all time.
So we're going to try something different here. I see so many hands up, and we are just about out of time. So we're going to take two different questions and let you both answer whatever aspects of them you want. So right here, front row, and then we'll go over there. So, and if we could go ahead and get a mic to, if you could stand so you're a little bit more visible, that'd be great.
Thanks, Ross. Great book. The week before I read this book, I read David Wallace's Wells book on climate change, which you wrestle with and I think take very seriously, to your credit as a conservative in this book. And I think unlike a lot of writers on the center right, you do take seriously his and other climate left concerns about climate migration, forest fires, diseases, et cetera. But you are somewhere in between saying these are just black swan events we don't really have to worry about, and these are going to make sustainable decadence impossible. And I'm just wondering why you don't agree with Wallace, Wells and company that in all likelihood catastrophe is less likely than a sustainable decadence, since you do take his evidence pretty seriously and summarize it in good faith.
Okay, that's question one. Question two.
Hi, I'm here as I think a far left Ross super fan. My question was about what you were saying about playing 1968 on Twitter. And in the 60s, I mean, a lot of the left people who were around thought that that itself was play acting what had happened in the 30s, and the idea that the students were the revolutionary class was, a joke. And the quote from Marx that you quote, about history happening as tragedy, as farce, there he was making the same point about 1848 and 1789. I mean, my question is, to what extent is decadence built into the very idea of progress? That so long as you have an idea of progress as a road that we're all walking on that has an arrow pointing forward, that decadence is immediately going to be there. I mean, there are people in the 18th century already, the Rousseau, the Ross Douthat of the 18th century, right, who were already making that point before the revolution had even happened.
All right, so climatic catastrophe, decadence built into progress, and the role of revival.
Christine, do you want to, before I resolve all contradictions, do you have anything else?
Wow, I feel I should leave this to you, honestly.
I was hoping for a bailout there.
It's a black swan. It's coming.
So, I mean, I guess I might put it this way. I think decadence, as I'm defining it, or as Barzoon defines it, is a very common condition of civilization. It is sort of inherent in the idea of development. It's the idea that you will reach sort of plateaus and periods of repetition and, tragedy repeating itself as farce and all the rest. And I think that any given society at any given moment will contain a quantum of dynamism and a quantum of decadence. Right, and so even in moments of great, I look back on the period from the 40s to the 60s and see first remarkable growth and change, and then political turmoil. And people living in the late 60s could reasonably say this political turmoil is much more decadent than the 1930s. And I think both of those things are true. And similarly, the decadence that like the concern about low birth rates, right? It's not a novel concern. You get that all over the place in France, especially in the 19th century. And some of the darker forces unleashed in Western politics sort of were unleashed out of an anxiety about that decadence. So I think there is absolutely a kind of wave function of decadence and ways in which all of this has happened before and will happen again. At the same time, I think it's possible to sort of step back a little bit and look at the bigger picture and say, there was decadence in 1968, but our quantum of decadence might be a little bit larger right now, right? And that's, I think, in certain ways, the sort of narrow but expansive at the same time argument in my book that, that like the Frankfurt School, right, to pick a sort of, like the Frankfurt School looked at the consumer culture of the 50s and looked at sort of mass entertainment and saw a version of what I'm critiquing, what I think both of us are critiquing in technology and media today. And in certain ways, some of my analysis harkens back to them. But I think it's also reasonable to say that sort of social media and the iPhone in your pocket have advanced that decadence further than, the Dick Van Dyke Show did, right? So that's sort of a not comprehensive but plausible, maybe, answer. In climate change, so I mean, I am a layman and a newspaper columnist, neither a climate scientist nor an economist. So all of this analysis has its limits. But my layman's reading of the various climate scenarios, the various intergovernmental panels on climate change reports, and so on, has for a long time made me think that climate change fits more within a sort of sustainable decadence rubric than in Wallace Wells's more catastrophist rubric. And I spend a certain amount of time in the book, as you say, and as all of you will know once you read it and buy it for your friends and all the wonderful things you'll do, sort of contemplating what happens if Wallace Wells is right. Not that the whole Earth becomes uninhabitable, because he doesn't really argue that. But you gotta have a good title. But that we have a really wide uninhabitable zone of the Earth that feeds into population imbalances and creates mass migrations, and certainly changes the face of Eurasia and especially Europe and Africa. And that's, I think I take that scenario seriously. I think it's one of the obvious ways that the decadence I'm describing over the next 50 years could end in some combination of, I entertain sort of catastrophic and renewal-based visions of what that could mean. But if you ask me to place my bets, I would say that, I'll cite Wallace Wells himself, which is his big follow-up essay to the book a few months ago, basically said, look, when you look at the current data, the bands of likely climate developments have narrowed. And that's bad news insofar as the best case scenario is less likely, but it's good news insofar as RCP8, or, the scenario that's often cited for worst case, fires forever in California, uninhabitable equatorial belt, seems less likely than it did when that scenario was first developed. So I think that the climate science that we have, provisional as it is, points more towards climate change as a manageable problem for the developed world that will cause big problems in the developing world, but that could, not paradoxically, but in one of the cruel ironies of history, make it easier for the developed world to sort of stay rich and powerful because its challengers are dealing with ecological problems that the developed world's own development has caused. So that's the scenario I consider most likely in the book, and I think David's subsequent work has pushed him there's a little more convergence between us than there is between his original book and my argument.
And I don't have much to say on climate, as I am also not a scientist, but I think I'll keep banging this drum of action, which I do think was one of the more intriguing and compelling points that Ross makes in his book. To the question of 1968 and quantum of decadence, which maybe is another James Bond
movie.
James Bond that was postponed until after coronavirus is over. I think that one of the most interesting and compelling arguments in favor of a particular brand of decadence in this age is still the lack of action. I mean, comparing 1968 or the late 60s to today, one has to notice, like, yes, there are protesting students in both eras. Of course, in one era, there were 3,000 bombings in 1 year. And this year, Bernie Sanders says that he is going to create a youth revolution and turn out as flat from 2016. There is a difference between responding forcefully to decadence, to coming out en masse and proving it wrong, and to saying, we're not decadent, and also I would prefer to stay inside. And I think that this lack of movement, in some ways a lack of energy in real life, is perhaps one of, for me at least, the strongest pieces of evidence for this thesis. And actually that in some ways relates to climate perhaps too. Not actually what is happening to the climate, which I cannot explain in a scientific manner or give evidence for in this moment, but I'm interested in our response to a climate crisis. One can imagine, a crisis response, a revolution, people, again, coming out en masse, protesting, changing their lives, doing something. Today what we're seeing is youth anxiety and depression, which is something different. And that, to me, speaks more to decadence than anything else. I'll out myself as a nerd because I was very tickled by your reference to Frodo in the Ring earlier. I was incredibly into Lord of the Rings. And when I say was, I mean I still am, but I just try and talk about it less, and obviously I'm failing. But the energy behind that book, the entire engine, was that the society of Hobbiton was still, it was pleasant, and there was something lingering in the outskirts. And instead of, I guess, sinking into depression or playing Animal Crossing on their iPhones, Frodo and Sam got up and left and went to do something about the crisis at the borders, to get rid of the ring, to save the world. And that seems to be that element, that energy, that movement, that excitement that is disappearing. And that is the scariest thing to see, I think. That is the true exhaustion of a society.
So to end on a hopeful note, one sentence, or perhaps one paragraph from each of you, what gives you hope in our current situation?
I'm going to pass that to Ross first.
No, you have to go first. So, I mean, I think I've already suggested some things, right? I do find hope in the fact, so I've been working on this book, oddly, for quite a long time. I started it after the Romney-Obama campaign in 2012, and then was sidetracked first by an illness that will be the subject of my next book, stay tuned, and then by writing a book about Pope Francis. So I think that in spite of the fact that there's play acting and that the Sanders kids didn't turn out in force, and that, some of the very online Catholics are just like, pretending to run the Spanish Empire. In spite of all that, there are things that are less decadent about our politics right now than was the case in 2012. I feel like 2012 was a very decadent election. It was an election that felt like it was about nothing. It was about binders full of women and, the failed promise of Obamaism and this sort of rote, very conventional Republican message about how entrepreneurs are awesome and everybody else should just thank them every day. And our politics is more interesting now. And I think decadence still prevails. And again, it will prevail in the Biden presidency, but I see a lot more discontent with it, and I think that is, at the very least, it's not quite all the way to going to Mordor, but at least you're like looking at maps, right? Which is the real appeal of Tolkien anyway, is the maps. So that's a source of hope. And then, the reality is that part of the argument for why decadence isn't so bad is that even under decadence, you can, just because the whole society seems sterile doesn't mean that you can't get married and have kids. And in our case, God help us, have 4 of them, which compared to some of my Catholic friends is nothing, but compared to my secular friends seems like a lot. Just because the internet is there sort of killing that moment that Christine was talking about doesn't mean that you can't turn off your phone and go away for 6 months and try and write the great American novel. And, and under the shadow of the coronavirus, I sort of suspect that, as you suggested, that this crisis is exposing the flaws and failures of our system. But as in hurricanes and natural disasters, I think there will be moments when people rise to the occasion of the crisis, and that sort of it's happening right now in hospitals all over China and Italy and South Korea, and God help us, it'll be happening in our hospitals soon enough. And the human spirit is not, we're not in Brave New World. We're not actually being conditioned and decanted and genetically engineered to play certain roles. We're still human beings with all that entails. And when the crisis comes and the catastrophe threatens, we're still capable of doing terrible things, but great things as well. So, those are sources of hope.
Now that you've said it, thank you. That's why he's written a book and I'm still working on one. I think I would echo that, actually. I think that discussions like this are, despite their talk of Mordor and torpor and stasis, are actually encouraging. I do think that one of the, again, scary things about decadence or ideas is that it would happen and nobody would notice until it was too late. And one of the infuriating things and funny things, something that I do make fun of, people going into the wilderness and taking classes on how to skin deer, is still the fact that people are feeling that something is off. They're not dead to the feeling that perhaps something is missing. They still want to be more. They still would like to see the world change. Perhaps they don't know how to go about it yet. And maybe right now we're sort of channeling that feeling into buying expensive prairie dresses or expensive fancy axes, or pretending that we're like stocking up our little house on the prairie pantry under the shadow of coronavirus. But it still shows us that there's a capacity for something more, and that if we sort of continue to listen to that feeling and that voice and explore what futures are out there, since we're so tired of the one that we're living in, there is still time and space for things to change. And so I'm hopeful for actually young people, especially, who do seem really frustrated. For all that Bernie Sanders hasn't necessarily goosed turnout, young people and even older people are becoming awakened to the fact that perhaps this economy is not, in fact, working the way that it's supposed to be. Perhaps change is in order. Perhaps there is something that I should be doing or can be doing to make things better. Perhaps it's time for the world to change. And whether we actually make it to changing the world, or whether we come up with the exact right vision of what the new world could be, remains to be seen. But the fact that we can actually talk about changing it, the fact that we can recognize decadence and say, actually, this is not what I want. The fact that we can look at our iPhones and grimace and turn them off, even if we turn them on like an hour later. 5 minutes later, a minute later. Okay, we turn them to grayscale and they're still on, but we tried. We're trying, and there's still hope out there and a willingness and a longing for something better. And that longing is the one thing that always leads us.
Christine, Ross, thank you. So we want to encourage you. Signed copies, pre-signed copies for sale of the Decadent Society will be available on that table right as you exit the room. You do not have to wait in a signing line. They are pre-signed, minimize contact, stay healthy. We highly recommend
Team
that.
measure for which I apologize, but it seems sensible.
In addition to highly recommending the Decadent Society, we also want to highly recommend another invitation that should be on each of your chairs along with your hand sanitizer packet, which is the invitation to join the Trinity Forum Society. We try to make possible discussions like this among our thought leaders and thinking leaders about the big questions of life in the context of faith in really a very countercultural way. At the same time that so much of our culture is characterized by distraction, by triviality, by decadence, we try to provide a spot where big ideas are discussed with intellectual rigor and warm hospitality. There are a few other places like it. Your membership helps support those efforts, and we really encourage you to do that. Of course, there are several benefits to joining the Trinity Forum Society, including tonight a free pre-signed copy of the Decadent Society, which we encourage you to avail yourself of. In addition to that, there are many membership benefits of being part of the Society, which includes our daily list of what we're reading, curated reading recommendations on the intersection of faith, culture, history, politics, and the like, along with our quarterly readings, where we take the best of literature and letters, add an introduction, discussion questions in the back, so it's essentially a book club in the bag. If you read Ross's book, you'll see that he quotes significantly from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, G.K. Chesterton's Everlasting Man, and many others, Augustine, Aquinas. Get introduced to all of these folks through Trinity Forum readings, some of which are actually also available for sale at that same table. If you have any questions about this, I would love to talk with you, and so would my colleagues. Alyssa, Callie, and Hannah, can you stand and just wave so everyone can see you? You got to stand all the way up so people can see you. That would be terrific. If you'd like to share this event with others, please do so. Post on Facebook, post on Twitter. We would love that. And if you would like to help sponsor other evening conversations, we would love that. Please talk to Alyssa right there. Finally, as we wrap up, it's always appropriate to end with thanks. An evening like this does not happen without the hard work of many people who are involved. So I want to just thank again our sponsor, partner, and friend, the Pepperdine School of Public Policy, led by its talented and visionary dean. I keep waiting for you to be promoted to provost so I can say Provost Pete Peterson of the Pepperdine School of Public Policy, maybe one day soon. Would also like to thank our volunteers, Darian Cantu, Emma Ayers, Matthew McKnight, intern emeritus Emily Scholes, our brilliant photographer, Clay Blackmore, my talented colleagues, Alyssa Abraham, Hannah Smith, Callie Walker. Callie, it is her first evening conversation tonight, just joined us about 6 weeks ago, as well as our fantastic interns, Jenny Young, Noah and Noelle Mitchell. Thank you again, Ross and Christine. Thank you to all of you hardy souls for joining us tonight, and good night.